The Winds of Winter has taken a while to come out. A Dance with Dragons took a while to come out. A Feast for Crows took a while to come out because Martin struggled with this series since way back then. Because initially, his plan was to, after the third book in the series, A Storm of Swords, have a 5-year gap before its sequel, A Dance with Dragons. Not 5 years in our world, but 5 years in Westeros to allow all of these characters and their arcs to continue to develop. After a year of writing that idea, he found that it was unworkable. Certain characters and plot lines needed events to happen in that 5-year interlude that just really weren't working as flashbacks in terms of the story as a whole. A lot of those events resulted in that being split off into a new book, A Feast for Crows. And part of that problem with this new book is a lot of these events that Martin wanted to cover were not linked to existing viewpoint characters. When Martin had this problem in the past, he either introduced new viewpoint characters, which he did very sparingly back then. In A Clash of Kings, we only got 2 new viewpoints, same with the Storm of Swords, and later on that explodes, but we'll get to that. Martin has done in the past another method, that being prologue and epilogue chapters to show things that aren't tied to one of our existing viewpoints. So, Martin hatched a scheme. For A Feast for Crows, he was going to create what he came to call the Mega-Prologue, which ended up being over 250 pages long at a point of its conception. And today we'll be examining that chapter, what it means for the future of the series, and what exactly happened to it. I mentioned that Martin used to be very sparing in the use of new points of view in A Song of Ice and Fire, and that might surprise you, because of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, where he gets very fast and loose with who he wants to add as a viewpoint at any point in the series, and a lot of that comes from the Mega-Prologue. The Mega-Prologue was intended to cover 2 areas of Westeros where we did not have any viewpoint characters, as both regions had important events coming directly from the ending of A Storm of Swords, and things that had happened therein. Those 2 regions are Dorne and the Iron Islands, both of which are very politically isolated, and the only one of them that has been visited is the Iron Islands. That was for a couple chapters on Theon's behalf in A Clash of Kings. Theon has vanished by this point, and there really isn't anybody to see what's going on there, so Martin decided, oh, I know what I'll do. I'm going to create a large prologue chapter with chapters in and of itself, and I will allow these new characters to flesh out this world before getting into the meat of the story with my main viewpoint characters. This represents a pretty significant departure from Martin's typical prologues and epilogues. Usually, the prologue and epilogue viewpoint character die, which is a pretty unique and striking way to do things, as viewpoint characters don't die very much in Ice and Fire. Instead, with these mega prologue viewpoint characters, Martin's intention was to, yes, maybe kill some of them off, but those who were not killed off would essentially be handing the baton of the story on to other characters who were already viewpoints and allowing the kind of Dorne and Iron Island plots to seamlessly merge and integrate into the main story of Westeros and Ice and Fire as a whole. So all of these individual plot lines would have a bunch of individual viewpoint characters coming along with them, and some of them would die, some of them would survive. Some of those that would survive would be showing up later on in the main story just through other people's eyes, rather than remaining viewpoints on their own. They'd only have chapters in specifically this mega prologue. Martin first mentions this mega prologue at a convention in April of 2002, where I was about 1.5 years old for reference. We later get more details in August, where he reveals that at this point, it's already about 200 pages in length and 7 chapters long. We learn later on that it swells to a total of 12 chapters before Martin ends up scrapping the idea in its entirety. We have a list of kind of chapters from an early draft of A Feast for Crows from October of 2003, which I'll throw on screen for you now. And by this point in October 2003, it appears that the mega prologue is no more. It has been shattered, and the chapters that he'd already written or had been planned have been dispersed throughout A Feast for Crows to be just normal viewpoint chapters, rather than coming before and being these kind of strange half steps between regular viewpoints and prologue slash epilogue viewpoints. There are also a variety of different changes here, in that ordering seems to be mixed around, and we do have other sources on these chapters from this same time. We actually know some of these chapters specifically that were contained in the Mega Prologue, as Martin published some of them in weird forms and ended up reading a few of them at conventions, either of which I would kill for today. But at conventions, Martin read both The Captain of the Guards, the first Ariohocha chapter, and The Queenmaker, which is the first Arion Martell chapter. Additionally, Arms of the Kraken was published in a magazine in March of 2003. This contained the first 4 Ironborn chapters from A Feast for Crows, those being Aaron 1, which is the Prophet, the Kraken's Daughter, Asha's first chapter, the Iron Captain, Victarion's first chapter, and then the Drowned Man, which is Aaron 2, was at that point called the Priest, and that is the chapter that contains the King's Moot. These seem to kind of set the stage for what these viewpoints were supposed to be in this mega prologue. We see that there are a total of 5 viewpoints that he has read beforehand, those being Aaron, Arion, Ario. There are too many A names. Victarion and I'm missing one. Asha. Yeah, that's it. But overall, these characters are added by one more. We have Aris Oakheart coming into Dorne in the published A Feast for Crows, and there is evidence that he was planned for this mega prologue as well. We don't have direct evidence that his chapter was read at any point. 2 questions. 1, do you think the Mega Prologue should have stayed intact? Do you think the series would be better off if there was this kind of consolidation of viewpoints? Or, alternative question, or also question, who's your favorite viewpoint to come out of the Mega Prologue? Love to hear your opinions on both in the comments. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It's free and it really helps the channel. We know that the Mega Prologue was dismantled by October of 2003, but later on, in 2004, we hear from George as to the final state of this set of chapters. He specifically says that between the Ironborn and the Dornish stories, there were 12 chapters written intended to be contained within this first section of Feast for Crows that would exclusively be for these characters. At that point, he says that 7 of them are for one group and 5 of them are for the other, though there are conflicting reports on which is which. Some people think it's 7 Ironborn, 5 Dornish. Others think it's 7 Dornish, 5 Ironborn. I personally buy the first interpretation. We have a lot more Ironborn in the story than we do Dornish in terms of just how the story turned out in A Dance with Dragons, but I thought it'd be interesting to speculate on what these chapters might have been, as in the time since 2003, 2004, we've had a number of interesting developments, specifically drafts, outlines, and other writings of George Martin's from throughout this era that seem to indicate chapters and what they were intended to contain. Specifically, there is an outline from George R.R. Martin's own hand that was discovered, I think, a year or 2 ago. I covered it when people brought it to light, but it's an outline that contains a number of events that he seems to want to contain in the first version of A Feast for Crows. This seems to come both before A Feast for Crows was split off from A Dance with Dragons and before the death of the Mega Prologue, as there are some deviations between this and the list of chapters we have from October of 2003. Specifically, on the Dornish side, we see 3 events listed there. Balon versus Eris, which is assumedly a duel between Balon Swan and Aris Oakheart, these 2 Kingsguard who are sent to Dorne at different points. End with Blood and Fire, which is the way that the Dornish story ends in A Feast for Crows, with Arion learning of her father's plot to help the Targaryens. And then Mountain Missing Tooth. So that's the mountain skull likely being sent to Dorne, and Missing Teeth. That is likely an indication that the mountain's head is not the mountain's head. Cersei's done a bait and switch, and the Dornish are likely going to know about it. There are 2 more relevant pieces of information here before I try to kind of piece this mega prologue back together and see what chapters were initially intended to be in this mega prologue and which ones kind of spun out of it and grew from it as the story organically kind of began to garden out of control. The first comes from an early draft of the Daenerys story where Quaith's warnings change. Initially, Quaith was supposed to warn Daenerys of Crow and Kraken coming to see her, rather than Kraken and Dark Flame. Kraken and Dark Flame is pretty clearly Victarion and Makoro, who show up in Meereen at the end of the actually published Dance with Dragons, but Crow and Kraken seems to indicate that instead of Makoro, both Victarion and Euron were making for Slaver's Bay together, rather than Euron just sending his brother off to do his bidding for him. Additionally, G-Steph, Reddit poster who went through George's notes at the Cushing Library, did find evidence that Victarion was initially supposed to die in this very early draft of A Feast for Crows. Specifically, we have the King's Brother, which becomes the Reaver chapter, and then in a list of potential chapters for the future of the series, Martin lists that there should be 1 additional Victarion chapter where Victarion is killed. So it seems that Euron will be making his way to Slaver's Bay and intersecting with Daenerys there. So let's put it together. What was the original Mega Prologue? I'll start off with the Dornish side. I think the breakdown of chapters that makes the most sense is 5 Dornish, 7 Ironborn, as there are a lot more Ironborn chapters in the published material than the Dornish, and I do think that overall these chapters, as we have for the ideas that the Dornish plot is going to have to follow, fit a lot more cleanly into 5 chapters than the Ironborn story would. So we have a number of published chapters already. We have Ario's first chapter, which is the Captain of the Guards, followed by the Soiled Light, the Queenmaker, the Princess in the Tower, and then in the Dance with Dragons, the Watcher. I think this is pretty true to life with how the actual trajectory of the Dornish story would have played out, with some shifts. I think a lot of those changes deal with the Queenmaker plot and the actual Watcher chapter itself. So it's pretty clear that Area o Hota was not initially supposed to be the viewpoint for the Watcher chapter, in that I think it was originally Aerys Oakheart. Aerys Oakheart was initially going to survive the Queenmaker plot and fight a duel against Balon Swan. I think that duel would likely occur when Balon arrives in Dorne with the skull of Gregor Clegane that is not actually Gregor Clegane. This would likely lead to these two Kingsguard knights fighting, dueling each other, probably both dying, similarly to the ancient story of the Cargill brothers that we see in House of the Dragon. I think that's the most likely outcome there, and I could see that chapter ending with Fire and Blood, shifting that from the Princess in the Tower to the ending of the Dornish story, as seems to be told in Martin's outline there. And it would very much make sense. It would set the Dornish up to be intersecting with other plot lines in the very near future, because we see at the end of the Watcher chapter, a number of Dornish emissaries are being sent to King's Landing to work at court, where they would intersect with the Cersei story and kind of broaden things there, which would make a lot of sense. I think that that would very much track with the Dornish story, and not much overall changed from the Mega-Prologue here, other than just the lengths of these chapters and the order of some events, and, sorry, Aerys' death. The Ironborn story is a bit more complicated. The arms of the Kraken are pretty much locked in. We have 4 Ironborn chapters set to go no matter what. We have the Prophet, we have the Drowned Man, we have the Kraken's daughter, we have the Iron Captain, and we know the King's brother, which would come to be known as the Reaver, is also planned too. So that is Victarion being told the plan by Euron to go and get Daenerys. We do have kind of dueling drafts of this chapter, with Victarion in the published material being sent on his own, and Euron coming with him in older drafts that we've seen from the Cushing Library. But overall, we know that beyond that, Victarion is intended to have one more chapter where he is eventually killed, likely by Euron, or at the very least, Euron would be continuing along the story to eventually intersect with Daenerys. That leaves us at 6 Ironborn chapters total for this section of the story, and there are 2 distinct possibilities as to the rest of this storyline. Specifically, I could see Asha having one more chapter, I could see Aeron having one more chapter. Aeron, of course, has the Forsaken chapter. Perhaps that was initially supposed to be Euron taking Aeron along to Slaver's Bay, taunting his brother after Victarion's death, and just torturing him with these visions ahead of the pair's arrival to Daenerys, where they eventually intersect with that story, and the torch is picked up by normal viewpoints. Or it could be Asha fleeing after the Kingsmoot in the Wayward Bride chapter, until she eventually intersects with her brother Theon's perspective after the end of his story in A Dance with Dragons. Either of these possibilities would very much be plausible in the story itself. I lean towards Asha being the final chapter here, as Aeron would already have 2 at this point, and that'd be lopsided from Asha only having 1. And I like the idea that Asha's story could end up intersecting with Theon's, and leaving off hers with the Kingsmoot really doesn't tie that up quite well. The Wayward Bride ties into what Euron forces her to do in getting married right after the Kingsmoot, and I think it would very much tie her story to Stannis in an interesting way as well. So my preferred version of the Mega-Prologue would contain that. So what does the Mega-Prologue mean for the Winds of Winter? I think it can very much give us some insight into Martin's overall mentality when dealing with these characters that were spawned from this initial prologue idea. I think Martin is very focused on his main characters. I think that's my main takeaway. In that all of these viewpoints were initially intended to be supplementary. Yes, their stories have grown beyond that, and they are definitely going to be expanded as they continue to grow into the Winds of Winter, as Martin has done a great job really fleshing out each of these individuals. With that said, I don't think Martin would really be holding much back in terms of killing off any of these viewpoints who were initially supposed to maybe die or maybe just fade into the background. And additionally, I think he might view it as kind of housekeeping from this Mega-Prologue grown out of control that has, in a sense, kind of taken over portions of the story. I think it also tells us that we're not going to see much of Ario Hotah in the Winds of Winter, in that his adventure to get Darkstar and Dorne, if I had to guess, is probably going to take only a chapter or so. He might be killed at the end of that chapter, maybe not, but this seems to indicate that Martin doesn't super need a viewpoint in the Iron Islands or in Dorne for the future of the story as it continues and goes forward, but rather he wanted viewpoints there for that specific moment, reacting to the King's Moot or to Oberyn's death, but really not necessary going forward. It's also interesting to note that while many drafts have been unearthed of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons during this early period of development, really none exist that contain the Mega-Prologue. We have Arms of the Kraken, which do have some differences from the published material in the final book, which does contain a part of the Mega-Prologue, but that really hasn't been found outside of these few references and notes he's had on other blogs, on panels, on whatnot. So it'd be really interesting to see if any more would be unearthed with time as this idea of the Mega-Prologue is kind of more fleshed out and more researched by the community. What did Martin do instead of the Mega-Prologue? He introduced us to an entirely new region as well, and one that will become probably pretty important in the Winds of Winter, and one that is going to be probably pretty confusing in the Winds of Winter. That being Old Town, to the eyes of Pate the Acolyte, who we later on see replaced by a faceless man at the very end of A Feast for Crows. It's a good way to wrap up the book, but overall, it's hard to say whether that or the Mega-Prologue would have worked better for the narrative as it stands. To me, the Mega-Prologue exemplifies both Martin's strengths and weaknesses as a writer. It failed because each of these characters developed organically on their own into real people with real stories that Martin wanted to tell, as they're all pretty compelling characters in their own right. With that said, its failure also represents what Martin tends to have as his greatest failure. The story continues to grow out of control, seemingly of its own accord and without him being at the reins and being able to rein it in to be a compelling, concise, and actually written vision. Overall, I'm happy that these characters all have chapters throughout A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, but I can't help but wonder what might have happened if the Mega-Prologue had survived. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. It's free and it really helps me grow the channel. I'll have many more videos for you on A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, Dunkin' Egg in the very near future, and I look forward to sharing all of those with you. I also now have a Patreon, which you can find in the description if you want to support the channel. But yeah, thank you again so much for your time, and I will see you very soon. Goodbye, everyone.